It is Christmas Day, 1991. In a small room in the Kremlin, a 60-year-old man with a birthmark on his forehead sits down in front of a television camera. He is wearing a plain dark suit. There is no ceremony, no audience, no military guard of honor. He reads a short statement in a quiet voice. He says he is resigning his position. He signs a document transferring control of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. He takes off his watch and hands it to an aide. Then he stands up and walks out of the room. His name is Mikhail Gorbachev, and the country he has just resigned from no longer exists. The Soviet Union, 15 republics, 290 million people, the largest nation on Earth by land area, the state that defeated Nazi Germany, that launched the first satellite and the first human into space, that held the second largest nuclear arsenal in human history, ceased to exist on that day, not because it lost a war, not because it was invaded or conquered or bombed into submission. It dissolved from within, peacefully, in less than a year. No empire in this series fell faster. No superpower in modern history has ever disappeared so completely, so quickly, and with so little warning. The CIA did not predict it. Western governments did not predict it. Most Soviet citizens did not predict it. Most Soviet citizens did not predict it. This is the story of how it happened. To understand why the Soviet Union collapsed, you first need to understand what it was holding together and how much force that required. The USSR was not a nation in any organic sense. It was an empire built on ideology and maintained by coercion. 15 republics spanning 11 time zones, from the Baltic states in the west to the Russian Far East, were held together by the Communist Party, the KGB secret police, the Red Army, and the shared mythology of the Soviet project. Different ethnicities, different languages, different religions, different histories, all compressed under the same red flag and told they were building the future together. For decades, the compression held. Terror under Stalin, conformity under his successors, and the genuine ideological conviction of a generation that had survived the Second World War believing the Soviet system had saved them. But by the 1970s, the system was showing age. Economic growth had slowed to a crawl. Corruption was everywhere. The gap between official Soviet statistics and Soviet reality, between what the government said was happening and what ordinary citizens could see with their own eyes, had become impossible to ignore. The shelves in state stores were increasingly empty. The apartments were crumbling. The technology was falling behind the West. The ideology that had demanded sacrifice for a better future was producing neither the future nor the sacrifice willingly. The system needed reform. Everyone inside it knew it. The question was whether reform was possible without destroying the system it was meant to save. Two events in the 1980s cracked the foundations before Gorbachev ever arrived. The first was Afghanistan. In December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up a communist government that was losing a civil war. Soviet military planners expected a quick stabilization operation. What they got was a 10-year war against Mujahideen fighters supplied by the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan with weapons, money, and Stinger missiles that could shoot down Soviet helicopters. The Afghan war killed 15,000 Soviet soldiers and wounded hundreds of thousands more. It cost the Soviet economy roughly $2 to $3 billion a year, at a time when the economy could not afford it. More damaging than the casualties and the cost was the exposure. The myth of Soviet military invincibility, carefully maintained since the victory over Nazi Germany, was shattered by footage of Soviet conscripts being sent home in zinc coffins from a country nobody had asked them to die in. The second crack came on April 26, 1986. At 1:23 in the morning, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Soviet Ukraine exploded. It was the worst nuclear accident in human history. The Soviet government's initial response was exactly what the Soviet government always did: denial, concealment, and the suppression of information. Local officials were told to continue the May Day parade in the nearby city of Pripyat while the reactor core burned. It took 36 hours to begin evacuating civilians. By that time, hundreds of thousands had been exposed to radiation. Gorbachev later said that Chernobyl was perhaps the real cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union, not because of the radiation, because of what it revealed. The system had lied, reflexively, automatically, instinctively, and people, for the first time in large numbers, had seen it lying in real time. Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in March 1985, understanding that the Soviet system was in trouble. He was younger than his predecessors, 54 when he took office, and had genuinely absorbed the scale of the problems. His response was two interconnected reforms: glasnost, openness, the loosening of censorship, the permission to discuss problems publicly, the end of the reflexive secrecy that had defined Soviet governance since Stalin, and perestroika, restructuring, an attempt to decentralize the Soviet economy, introduce limited market mechanisms, and reduce the stranglehold of party bureaucracy on economic decisions. Both reforms were intended to save the Soviet system by making it more honest and more efficient. Both produced exactly the opposite of what Gorbachev intended. Glasnost did not produce a controlled conversation about Soviet problems. It produced an avalanche. 70 years of suppressed grievance, about the gulags, about the famines, about the purges, about the lies, about the gap between Soviet promise and Soviet reality, poured into the public space all at once. Newspapers published investigations that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Television broadcast discussions of historical atrocities the state had denied for generations. The non-Russian republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, began publicly asserting national identities that Soviet policy had spent decades trying to dissolve. And perestroika, rather than improving the economy, introduced enough instability to make the existing distribution networks collapse without creating new ones fast enough to replace them. By 1989, Soviet citizens were experiencing the worst shortages in decades. The reforms had broken what was already broken further. In 1989, the Outer Empire went first. The satellite states of Eastern Europe read Gorbachev's signals, his statements that the Soviet Union would not use military force to suppress political change, and acted with stunning speed. Poland held free elections in June 1989. Hungary opened its border with Austria. East Germans began fleeing west through Hungary in their thousands. In November, the Berlin Wall fell, as we covered in the previous episode, not through military action, but through bureaucratic error and the accumulated pressure of a population that had stopped believing. By the end of 1989, every Soviet satellite government in Eastern Europe had collapsed or been replaced. Romania's communist dictator Nicolae Ceausescu was executed on Christmas Day 1989, exactly 2 years before Gorbachev would resign. The speed of it shocked everyone, including Gorbachev. He had expected managed reform. He got a revolution he could not control. Inside the Soviet Union, the nationalist movements in the republics were accelerating. The three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, declared independence in 1990. Gorbachev imposed economic sanctions and briefly sent troops to Lithuania, where Soviet forces killed 14 civilians at a television tower in January 1991. The crackdown failed to intimidate. It only hardened the independence movement. By mid-1991, it was clear to almost everyone watching that the Soviet Union in its existing form could not survive. The question was not whether it would dissolve, but how and how fast. The answer came in 3 days in August 1991. On August 19, a group of hardline Communist Party officials, calling themselves the State Committee on the State of Emergency, staged a coup against Gorbachev while he was on holiday in Crimea. They cut his communications, surrounded his dacha with troops, and announced on Soviet television that Gorbachev had been removed from power due to health reasons. Tanks rolled into Moscow. The coup plotters expected the Soviet system to fall into line as it always had. It did not. Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic and Gorbachev's chief political rival, climbed on top of a tank outside the Russian parliament building and addressed a crowd of tens of thousands of Muscovites who had gathered to resist. He called the coup unconstitutional. He called for a general strike. He demanded the army stand with the people. The image of Yeltsin standing on that tank, defiant, enormous, slightly disheveled, went around the world, and crucially, the army did not follow orders. Soldiers refused to fire on civilians. Tank crews accepted food and flowers from the crowd surrounding their vehicles. The coup plotters, faced with a military that would not obey and a population that was not afraid, lost their nerve. Within 72 hours, the coup had collapsed. The plotters were arrested. Gorbachev returned to Moscow. But the world he returned to was not the world he had left 3 days earlier. The coup attempt had destroyed the last remaining legitimacy of the Communist Party. Yeltsin banned the party in Russia. Republic after republic declared independence. By December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met in a forest in Belarus and signed a document dissolving the Soviet Union and replacing it with a loose Commonwealth of independent states. They did not consult Gorbachev. They informed him afterward. He resigned on Christmas Day. The flag came down. The largest country on Earth ceased to exist. So why did the Soviet Union fall? The same answer this series keeps finding in different forms. Not because an enemy defeated it. Not because a single catastrophic event destroyed it. The Soviet Union fell because of the accumulated weight of structural problems that the system could not acknowledge, could not discuss, and therefore could not fix. The closed information environment that was supposed to protect the Soviet state from destabilizing truths was the same environment that prevented Soviet leaders from understanding how serious their problems actually were. When Gorbachev finally opened the information environment, when he let the truth in, the truth was worse than the system could survive. That is the specific lesson of the Soviet collapse. Authoritarian systems are not strong because they suppress dissent. They are fragile because suppressing dissent means suppressing the information leaders need to govern effectively. Every problem that was not reported honestly became a problem that was not solved. And 70 years of unsolved problems had accumulated into a weight that no reform, however well-intentioned, could lift in time. What the Soviet collapse left behind matters as much as the collapse itself. 15 new nations, most of them unprepared for independence, most of them economically devastated, all of them inheriting borders drawn by Soviet administrators who had never imagined those borders would one day be international frontiers. The ethnic conflicts, the economic chaos, and the political instability of the 1990s in the former Soviet space were the direct inheritance of how the Soviet Union had been built and how it fell. And the man who rose to power in Russia in the vacuum that followed, the man who called the Soviet collapse the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, is a story for another episode. This is the Fallen Empires. We have now covered 10 fallen empires, from Rome to the Soviets. Next episode, we step into the present, China, Russia, and America. 3 powers, 1 world. And the question every empire in this series has eventually had to answer: who falls next? Subscribe, and we will see you there.